Two sources with direct knowledge of the matter just told CBS News something that should stop every single person following this war in their tracks. The United States has used nearly all of its entire global stockpile of long-range precision missiles fighting Iran. Not its Middle East reserves, not a regional supply line. Its entire global stockpile, the weapons America keeps in reserve for every theater on Earth, drawn down to near exhaustion by a single 5-month war against one country. That revelation landed in the same 48-hour window as something else almost nobody saw coming, reporting that President Trump had quietly decided, over the weekend, not to carry out what he himself had described as the biggest U.S. military attack since World War II, choosing instead, at the last minute, to pursue a diplomatic path with Iran and Oman that now has oil markets falling and stocks surging to record highs on hopes the war might actually be winding down. Two massive stories, breaking within days of each other. One suggests the United States is running dangerously low on one of the most important categories of weapons in its entire arsenal. The other suggests the president pulled back from the largest strike of the entire war at the 11th hour. Are those two stories connected? By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why defense analysts are treating this specific week as one of the most consequential turning points of the entire conflict, and why the honest answer to what's actually happening here is more complicated and more revealing than either headline on its own. Here's what we're covering. We're going to walk through exactly what's confirmed about America's precision missile stockpile, how serious this shortage actually is, and why the Pentagon has downplayed it publicly even as two independent sources went on the record about it. We're going to lay out the actual sequence of events from this past weekend, the canceled biggest strike since World War II, the sudden pivot toward a deal with Iran and Oman, and Trump's now familiar pattern of 48-hour deadlines. And then we're going to connect those two stories directly, because the timing here is not a coincidence, and understanding why changes how you should read literally everything coming out of this war over the next few days. Stay with me, because this is a lot bigger than a single headline. Quick note before we dig in. A story like this, breaking fast, sourced to anonymous officials, moving markets in real time, is exactly the kind of situation where it's easy to either overreact or dismiss it entirely. My job here is neither. I'm going to tell you clearly what's independently reported and sourced, what remains officially unconfirmed or denied, and where genuine uncertainty exists, because a story this significant deserves that level of care, not a rush to the most dramatic possible conclusion. Let's start with the missile stockpile itself, because that's the piece of this story that should concern you most. According to CBS News, citing two sources with direct knowledge of the matter, the United States has used nearly all of its global stockpile of long-range precision missiles during the war with Iran. That's a specific, sourced claim, not speculation, and it deserves to be treated with the seriousness it warrants. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has previously dismissed concerns about the stockpile publicly, but dismissing a concern is not the same as refuting the underlying reporting, and two independent sources going on record with a claim this specific to a major news organization in the middle of an active war is not something that happens casually. Here's why the word global in that reporting matters so much. A regional shortage would be serious on its own. It would mean American forces in the Middle East specifically might have to ration or slow their use of the most precise, longest-range weapons in their arsenal. But a global stockpile shortage means something considerably bigger. It means the same category of weapon that would be needed in a crisis anywhere else in the world. A contingency involving China and Taiwan, a NATO confrontation with Russia, any other flashpoint entirely unrelated to Iran has also been drawn down by this single 5-month campaign. Long-range precision missiles are not weapons. The American defense industrial base can simply manufacture on demand within weeks. Production timelines for the most advanced systems in this category are typically measured in years, which means a shortage identified today reflects a vulnerability that doesn't get fixed quickly, no matter how urgently the Pentagon wants it to. This isn't the first sign of strain in this war's munition supply either. Reporting throughout the summer had already flagged concerns about missile interceptor stockpiles being drawn down faster than they could be replenished. A related but distinct problem. Interceptors defend against incoming attacks, while the long-range precision missiles in this new reporting are primarily offensive strike weapons. Together, those two threads paint a picture of an American military that has, over 5 months of sustained combat, drawn meaningfully on multiple categories of advanced munitions simultaneously, at a pace that raises real questions about how much longer the current tempo of this war can actually be sustained without either a significant production surge or a change in strategy. There's a strategic dimension to this that goes well beyond Iran specifically, and it's the reason this story matters even to people who have no interest in this war at all. Long-range precision missiles are the same broad category of weapon that would be central to any American response in a potential future crisis involving Taiwan or in reinforcing NATO's eastern flank against Russia. Defense planners have spent years building stockpiles specifically sized around the assumption that the U.S. might need to fight, or credibly threaten to fight, in more than one theater simultaneously. A stockpile drawn down to near exhaustion by a single 5-month regional war undermines exactly that assumption. And allies and rivals alike are capable of reading defense reporting just as easily as anyone watching this video. If Beijing or Moscow now has good reason to believe American precision strike capacity is meaningfully depleted, that's not just a logistics story, it's a deterrence story. And deterrence that depends on an adversary believing you have the capacity to follow through works considerably less well once serious, sourced doubt about that capacity becomes public. It's also worth understanding why the Pentagon has strong incentives to downplay a story like this, regardless of how accurate it actually is. Publicly confirming a critical weapons shortage in the middle of an active war hands a strategic advantage directly to Iran and to anyone else weighing how much pressure the United States can actually still bring to bear. That means Secretary Hegseth's public dismissal of stockpile concerns doesn't necessarily tell you the concerns are false. It may simply reflect the fact that no defense secretary in history has ever publicly confirmed a critical weapons shortage, while that shortage was still operationally relevant. The absence of an official confirmation is not the same as evidence the reporting is wrong, and CBS News going ahead with a story this specific from 2 independent sources in the middle of an active war suggests its own editorial confidence in the underlying reporting. Now let's bring in the second half of this story, because the timing here is the part that should genuinely get your attention. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, President Trump reportedly decided over the weekend not to carry out what he had previously described as the biggest U.S. military attack since World War II, choosing instead, in what's now become a familiar pattern throughout this war, to advocate at the last minute for a diplomatic solution rather than follow through on the threatened strike. Think about what that means on its own terms first, independent of the stockpile story. The President of the United States had reportedly prepared and then pulled back from a strike large enough to be described, by his own characterization, as the biggest American military attack since the Second World War. That's not a minor escalation being reconsidered. That's a strike of genuinely historic scale, planned and then called off within the same weekend that reporting emerged about America's precision missile stockpile running dangerously low. Trump's own public explanation for this pivot has consistently been framed around diplomatic progress rather than resource constraints. Speaking to reporters, he described talks with Iran as moving along very nicely and said repeatedly that a deal on reopening the Strait of Hormuz could happen within 48 hours. That specific phrase, 48 hours, is worth paying close attention to because it is not the first time Trump has used it in this exact war. Back on March 21st, Trump issued a 48-hour ultimatum demanding Iran fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz, warning on Truth Social that the United States would, in his words, hit and obliterate Iran's power plants, starting with the biggest one first, if Iran didn't comply within that window. Iran, in turn, warned it would retaliate by targeting all U.S.-linked energy infrastructure across the Middle East if that threat was carried out. That 48-hour deadline came and went without the promised infrastructure strikes, materializing in the form originally threatened. Then, by late March, Trump was publicly claiming he had pushed his own deadline back at Iran's request, even as Iran's government was simultaneously dismissing the American proposal on the table as, in its own words, one-sided and unfair. That's a documented pattern. Dramatic 48-hour deadlines, threats of historic scale consequences if they're missed, followed by extensions, pivots to diplomacy, or deadlines that simply pass without the threatened action fully materializing as described. Understanding that pattern is essential context for how much weight to put on this week's version of the same 48-hour promise. It doesn't mean the specific deal announcement is empty. It means a healthy, evidence-based skepticism is warranted before assuming this particular 48-hour window will resolve any differently than the ones that came before it in March. That pattern extended into early August as well, just days before this week's developments. According to a detailed daily tracking record of this war, President Trump opened August 3rd by calling Iran's leadership unbelievably duplicitous on social media, accusing Tehran of quietly requesting a meeting while publicly denying any discussions were taking place. Later that same day, he told reporters talks were, in fact, underway, describing the moment as Iran's last chance to sign a good document, and using the striking phrase that he wanted to give Iran every last chance before decapitation. That's not a minor rhetorical flourish. It's a direct public threat using regime-ending language, delivered days before the same president pivoted to describing talks as moving along very nicely. Meanwhile, Iran's own foreign ministry spokesman was telling reporters the exact opposite that same week, that Iran was not engaged in talks with Washington at all, and had no meetings planned with U.S. officials, insisting Iranian negotiators were dealing exclusively with Oman on shipping passage. Two governments describing the same days in almost completely contradictory terms. If you want the full picture connecting the missile stockpile story to this weekend's canceled strike, and the deal now dominating headlines, hit subscribe and turn on notifications now, because what actually happened this week with Iran and Oman is where this story gets genuinely significant. Here's what's confirmed as of this week. Iran and Oman's foreign ministries have both stated that the two countries have agreed on a specific route for ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz, and are now finalizing arrangements for jointly managing that passage. According to Axios, citing U.S. and regional officials, the three parties, the United States, Iran, and Oman, are preparing to announce a 60-day agreement that would allow commercial shipping to resume through the strait, with inbound vessels traveling through a northern lane near Iranian waters and outbound traffic routed through Omani waters, alongside a joint effort to clear naval mines from a central shipping lane to eventually restore full two-way navigation. That's a genuinely significant development if it holds. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil and natural gas supply, and its closure has been the single biggest driver of global economic disruption throughout this entire war. Markets reacted immediately and sharply to Trump's latest comments, with oil prices falling and stocks climbing to record levels on hopes that this 5-month war might finally be approaching some kind of resolution around its central economic flashpoint. But there's a significant catch buried in Iran's own official statements that most excited market coverage has underplayed. Iranian officials briefing state media have stressed that any actual reopening of the strait remains conditional on the United States ending its naval blockade of Iranian ports, a blockade that CENTCOM confirmed has redirected 48 commercial vessels since it was restarted on July 14th following the collapse of an earlier ceasefire. Iran's foreign ministry statement was blunt on this point, stating directly that the factors making the Strait of Hormuz insecure still exist on the part of the United States, specifically naming the naval blockade and what it called other aggressive and threatening actions against Iran and its interests. And there's one more wrinkle worth understanding. Iran continues to publicly deny it is holding any direct talks with Washington at all. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghaei has repeatedly emphasized that Tehran's negotiations are with Oman specifically, focused on shipping lane logistics, not with the United States directly, even as Trump's own public comments consistently frame this as progress in talks with Iran. Both of those framings can be technically true at the same time. Iran negotiating directly and exclusively with Oman, while the resulting agreement obviously requires American cooperation and buy-in to actually function. But the contradiction in public messaging is itself a signal that neither side wants to be seen as the party that broke first and came to the table directly. There's a reason Oman specifically keeps showing up at the center of this process, and it's worth understanding why. Oman shares the Strait of Hormuz with Iran geographically, giving it a direct, practical stake in how shipping lanes through the waterway actually get managed, separate from the broader US-Iran conflict entirely. It has also functioned as a trusted back-channel mediator between Washington and Tehran for years, predating this current war by decades, precisely because it maintains working relationships with both governments that neither the US nor Iran has with each other directly. That existing trust is likely a major part of why this specific deal is being routed through Muscat rather than through Qatar or Pakistan, both of which hosted earlier unsuccessful rounds of talks during this war. Iran's foreign ministry specifically noted this week that it has no plans to travel to Qatar or Pakistan for further negotiations, a detail that, combined with a direct denial of talks with Washington, reinforces the idea that Oman's channel is now viewed by Tehran as the only one currently worth pursuing. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent added his own voice to the optimistic messaging this week as well, publicly stating that a deal with Iran may be imminent, a comment that, combined with Trump's repeated 48-hour framing, helped drive the sharp market reaction. But it's worth noting that Secretary of State Marco Rubio struck a noticeably more cautious tone in his own public comments around the same time, confirming that progress had been made in talks, but stopping well short of declaring finality, a small but meaningful difference in tone between two of the administration's most senior officials, commenting on the exact same negotiations within the same news cycle. So now let's put the missile stockpile story and the canceled historic strike back together, because this is where the analysis actually gets interesting. There are two honest ways to read the decision not to carry out what would have been the biggest U.S. strike since World War II this past weekend. The first is the explanation Trump himself has offered publicly. Genuine diplomatic momentum with Iran and Oman made a massive new strike unnecessary, at least for now, and the administration chose negotiation over escalation because the negotiation was actually working. That explanation is entirely plausible on its own, and it's consistent with the real, confirmed progress on the shipping route agreement. The second possible reading is less comfortable, and it's the one the missile stockpile revelation forces onto the table, whether anyone in the administration wants to discuss it publicly or not. That a strike of the scale being described, the biggest since World War II, would have required drawing even further on a long-range precision missile stockpile that two independent sources say is already nearly exhausted globally. Under that reading, The pivot to diplomacy isn't purely, or even primarily, about Iran's sudden willingness to negotiate. It's at least partly about the physical, practical limits of what the U.S. military can currently sustain in terms of the specific category of weapon a strike that size would have demanded. I want to be precise about what I can and can't tell you here. There is no public reporting directly confirming that the stockpile shortage was the deciding factor in canceling that specific strike. That connection is a reasonable inference based on the timing and scale of both stories, not a confirmed fact. But it's an inference serious enough that it's very likely exactly the question defense analysts are asking privately right now, even if nobody inside the Pentagon is going to confirm it on the record. A president publicly framing a canceled historic strike purely as a diplomatic choice. In the same week, independent sources reveal the military capacity for that scale of strike may be genuinely strained, is precisely the kind of contradiction that deserves scrutiny rather than automatic acceptance of the more flattering official explanation. Stepping back further, this week represents a genuine inflection point in how this war might actually resolve, regardless of which explanation for the canceled strike turns out to be more accurate. If the missile stockpile constraint is a real, meaningful factor shaping American strategy right now, even partially, that changes the entire calculus of how this war likely ends. A war constrained by finite, slow-to-replace munitions doesn't end through escalating military pressure indefinitely. It ends through some combination of negotiated settlement and strategic patience, precisely the kind of framework the Iran-Oman shipping agreement represents, because the alternative, sustained maximum military pressure, may simply not be physically sustainable at the pace this war has run at for much longer. If, instead, the diplomatic pivot really is being driven primarily by genuine progress with Iran and Oman, independent of any resource constraint, that's also a meaningful signal. It would suggest Iran's own calculus has shifted enough, after 5 months of sustained pressure, naval blockade, strikes on missile infrastructure, economic damage from the closed strait, that a negotiated arrangement genuinely became the path of least resistance for Tehran as well, not just for Washington. Either way, the pattern from March is worth keeping firmly in mind as this specific 48-hour window plays out. A deal close is not a deal signed. A route agreed between Iran and Oman is not the same as the strait actually reopening, which Iran's own officials have explicitly tied to conditions, ending the naval blockade specifically, that the United States has not yet agreed to meet. The most likely outcome, based on this war's own documented pattern over the past 5 months, is neither a clean, immediate resolution nor a return to the largest strike in generations, but another incremental step in a long, grinding process of partial agreements, missed deadlines, and renewed tension that has defined this conflict since February. There's also a domestic political dimension to this pivot worth naming directly. An administration that spends months publicly threatening the biggest strike since World War II and then pulls back from it in favor of diplomacy needs that diplomatic outcome to actually materialize in some visible, tangible form, or risk the appearance of having backed down under pressure rather than made a strategic choice. That political need creates its own incentive to frame every incremental step, an agreed shipping route, a 48-hour promise, as more conclusive and more imminent than the underlying reality necessarily supports, independent of whatever is actually happening with America's missile stockpile behind the scenes. Recognizing that incentive doesn't mean assuming bad faith on anyone's part. It simply means treating optimistic, market-moving statements with the same evidentiary caution you'd apply to any other high-stakes claim made by a party with a strong interest in how that claim gets received. Let's bring this down to what actually matters beyond the strategic chess game, because this week's developments carry real consequences for real people. The market reaction alone tells you how significant investors and traders consider this moment to be. Oil prices falling and stocks surging to record highs on hopes of a resolution, movements that translate directly into real changes in fuel costs, shipping insurance, and broader economic conditions for people who have never followed a single headline of this war. The naval blockade alone has already redirected 48 commercial vessels since mid-July, each one representing cargo, crews, and economic activity disrupted by a conflict most of those affected have no direct stake in. The human cost on the ground has continued in parallel with all of this diplomatic maneuvering. Israel's military confirmed this week that 2 reserve soldiers were killed during combat in southern Lebanon, where Israel continues fighting the Iran-backed militant group Hezbollah, a reminder that this conflict's front lines extend well beyond the Strait of Hormuz and the missile stockpile question dominating this week's headlines. And, underneath the market optimism sits a simple, sobering fact. Even in the most positive, plausible reading of this week's news, a genuine deal reached within 48 hours. That deal would only be a temporary 60-day arrangement, not a permanent resolution, to a war that has already run for 5 months and shows no sign of a clean, final ending, regardless of how markets react to any single week's headlines. There's a broader risk lurking in how sharply markets have already reacted to a deal that isn't signed yet. Stocks climbing to record highs and oil prices dropping sharply on the mere possibility of a resolution means a huge amount of financial value has already been priced in before any actual agreement exists. If this week's 48-hour promise follows the same pattern as March's, extended, reframed, or quietly allowed to lapse without the full resolution, markets are currently pricing in, that gap between expectation and reality could produce its own sharp market correction, adding a further layer of economic volatility on top of everything this war has already caused. That's a real risk built into exactly the kind of optimistic, deadline-driven messaging this administration has repeatedly used throughout this conflict. And it's a risk that falls not on the officials making the promises, but on ordinary investors, businesses, and consumers who have to make real decisions based on signals that may or may not hold up. And there's a final human dimension worth naming plainly. Every one of the 14-plus American service members killed since this war began. Every Iranian civilian caught in strikes on missile infrastructure built near populated areas. Every sailor aboard a commercial vessel rerouted around a closed strait has been living through 5 months of exactly this kind of whiplash. Dramatic threats, sudden pivots to diplomacy, 48-hour promises that come and go, with no reliable way to know from week to week whether the war affecting their lives is about to end or about to escalate to its largest strike yet. That uncertainty is, in its own right, one of the most underdiscussed costs of a war fought this publicly, in real time, across social media posts and cable news hits, rather than through the more contained, controlled information environments of past conflicts. So if you want to track where this actually goes, here's what genuinely matters in the coming days. Watch whether Trump's 48-hour deal deadline actually produces a signed, confirmed agreement, or whether it follows the same pattern as March's 48-hour ultimatum, extended, reframed, or quietly allowed to pass without the promised outcome. That single data point will tell you a great deal about how much weight to put on this administration's deadline-driven public messaging going forward. Watch specifically whether the United States agrees to lift or significantly ease its naval blockade of Iranian ports, since Iran's own officials have stated directly that the strait's actual reopening depends on exactly that condition being met, regardless of what shipping lane logistics get finalized with Oman. Watch for any further, independently sourced reporting on the American precision missile stockpile, whether that means additional confirmation from other outlets, any shift in the Pentagon's public messaging beyond simple dismissal, or evidence of an emergency production push to begin rebuilding that stockpile. Any of those developments would tell you far more about the real strategic constraints shaping this war than any single diplomatic announcement. And watch how this specific 60-day framework, if it's actually signed, gets treated by both governments once it's in place. A temporary arrangement that both sides visibly work to extend or convert into something more permanent suggests a genuine mutual interest in de-escalation. A temporary arrangement that either side treats as a pause before resuming prior positions suggests this week's developments were more about managing immediate pressures on both the American and Iranian sides than resolving the underlying conflict. None of this requires special access. It's all publicly trackable through defense reporting, market data, and the public statements of every government involved. And together, it will tell you far more about whether this week was a genuine turning point or simply the latest chapter in an already long pattern of near deals and near strikes. Before you go, 2 things. First, if this connected the missile stockpile story to the canceled strike and the emerging deal in a way you hadn't seen laid out together before, share it with someone who's only caught one piece of the story in their feed. Second, I want your honest rate in the comments. Do you think the pivot to diplomacy this weekend was driven primarily by genuine progress with Iran? Or do you think the missile stockpile reporting reveals a resource constraint that shaped this decision at least as much as any diplomatic breakthrough? I read every comment on these breakdowns, and on a story unfolding this fast, I genuinely want your read on it. Here's where things actually stand. 2 independent sources told CBS News that the United States has used nearly all of its entire global stockpile of long-range precision missiles fighting this war, a serious sourced revelation that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has publicly dismissed but not directly refuted. In the same window, President Trump reportedly decided over the weekend not to carry out what he had described as the biggest U.S. military attack since World War II, pivoting instead toward a diplomatic push with Iran and Oman that has now produced an agreed shipping route through the Strait of Hormuz, a promised announcement within 48 hours, and a market reaction significant enough to send oil prices falling and stocks to record highs. But Iran's own officials have tied the strait's actual reopening to the U.S., ending its naval blockade specifically, a condition not yet met. And this exact 48-hour deadline pattern has been used and missed in its original form by this administration before, back in March. Whether this week marks the moment the missile stockpile reality forced a genuine strategic pivot, or simply the latest cycle in a 5-month pattern of near deals and near strikes, is something only the next 48 hours, and the ones after that will actually answer. What's confirmed right now is serious enough on its own. America's arsenal of one of its most important weapons categories is stretched thin globally. The biggest strike of this entire war came within a weekend of actually happening, and the war's central economic flashpoint may, or may not, finally be approaching a real resolution. Stay locked in, because whichever way this breaks, it's going to matter far beyond this 1 week of headlines.